Hollywood likes to sell us the myth of flawless legends, gods on screen, geniuses behind the curtain. But what if some of the brightest stars were also, well, not exactly the sharpest knives in the drawer? From Olympic heroes who couldn't read a script to sex symbols, who turned dumb into a career strategy, to gangsters who rejected Casablanca because it looked weird. Tonight we dive into the glittering, goofy, and gloriously dumb side of old Hollywood. Number 1. Wallace Beery, Hollywood's lovable brute with a brain on vacation. Wallace Beery was one of MGM's biggest box office draws in the 1930s. Gruff voice, hulking frame, a kind of lumbering charm that made audiences eat him up. He even snagged an Oscar for The Champ in 1931. On screen, he was America's tough but tender everyman. Off-screen, let's just say subtlety wasn't in his vocabulary. Insiders whispered that Beery wasn't exactly a thinking man's actor. In fact, directors often stripped his scripts of nuance, because if you gave Wally too much emotional depth or complicated lines, he'd just stare at the page like it was written in Greek. According to MGM records, he memorized dialogue phonetically. He could repeat the words sure, but had zero idea what they meant. And his temper legendary. Joan Crawford loathed him, once calling him cruel, stupid, and arrogant. Young co-star Jackie Cooper claimed Beery would literally pinch him mid-scene to make him cry on camera. Method acting. Nope, just good old-fashioned bullying. Directors dreaded his improvisations, which often left bruises. But Beery's questionable judgment wasn't limited to set. He dove headfirst into bizarre investments, ostrich farms, novelty candy shops, convinced each one would be the next gold rush. Spoiler alert, none of them were. When asked at a political event to share his thoughts, Beery shrugged and said, "I ain't got time for them kind of thinking." Translation brains were optional when you had brawn. Number 2. George Raft, the gangster who shot himself in the foot. George Raft looked like he'd been born in a fedora. Slick hair, sharp suits, the voice, the swagger. He was the living embodiment of 1930s gangster cool. In fact, before Humphrey Bogart was Humphrey Bogart Studios were grooming Raft to be the big mobster star. But here's the plot twist. While Bogart rose to icon status, Raft kept tripping over his own bad decisions until his career was one long what if. Raft grew up tough in Hell's Kitchen and knew real mobsters guys like Bugsy Siegel and Frank Costello were his actual friends. That street cred landed him roles, but reading scripts, not his strong suit. He famously picked projects by asking, does the guy look tough if the character wasn't punching someone or snarling in a corner? George wasn't interested. That logic led him to reject a little movie called The Maltese Falcon. Who got it, Bogart? Who instantly became a star? Then came Casablanca. Raft thought it was just some weird war picture in past. Bogart said thanks again. And when Double Indemnity came along, Raft refused. Too dark, too morally complicated. Translation 3 of Hollywood's greatest films slipped through his fingers because he couldn't think past the trench coat. Studio execs were tearing their hair out. A Warner Brothers memo in 1942 described him as alarmingly short-sighted. Meanwhile, George was busy gambling away money with mob pals and shrugging off criticism with lines like, "I go with what I know." Unfortunately, what he knew was how to tank a promising career. By the 1960s, Raft was reduced to cameos in second-rate films, the tough guy Sheen long gone. Number 3. Johnny Weissmuller, Tarzan, with muscles not brain cells. Johnny Weissmuller wasn't just Tarzan for a while, he was Hollywood's ultimate jungle king. 5 Olympic gold medals, a roar that rattled theater walls, and a body sculpted by the gods. MGM handed him a loincloth in 1932, and boombox office history was made. But once the cameras stopped rolling, the myth cracked. Johnny bless his biceps had the brainpower of a coconut. Studio execs quickly realized their new star couldn't memorize lines to save his life. Directors had to chop dialogue and swap it for action. When he blanked on set, he'd grunt swing and hope no one noticed. Spoiler, everyone noticed. One crew member joked, "We just let him swing. He was better with the rope than the script." And money? Forget it. Johnny made millions, but spent it like a kid in a candy store. Failed hotels, ridiculous Tarzan-themed restaurants, you name it. By the 60s, he was broke wandering Las Vegas halls in a bathrobe, still calling himself Tarzan. Romantic life, pure chaos. 5 marriages, 1 impulsive proposal after a single night at a nightclub. His friends called him sweet, but hopelessly naive. The kind of guy who'd trust a stranger with his last dime. Number 4. Ed Wood. The king of bad movies and delusional genius. If Hollywood had a crown for world's worst filmmaker, Ed Wood would have worn it proudly and probably paired it with a feather boa. Edward D. Wood Jr. believed he was a misunderstood genius, but the rest of the world saw him as the Picasso of cinematic disasters. His magnum opus, Plan 9, from Outer Space 1959, is often called the worst movie ever made, and for good reason. He cast Bela Lugosi, a fading silent star. Then the poor man died. Did Ed shut down production? Of course not. He grabbed a taller guy, tossed a cape over his face, and told audiences to just go with it. Flying saucers, paper plates on strings. Dialogue. A mashup of typos, random nonsense, and unintentional comedy gold. Colleagues swore Ed had no clue how cameras worked. He'd shoot entire scenes out of focus and never check. Scripts looked like they'd been written in a hurry on cocktail napkins. But here's the kicker: Ed thought every line was Shakespeare. Actor Paul Marco said Ed would grin after a take and declare, "Pure art, baby." Meanwhile, audiences were howling for the wrong reasons. Number 5. Jane Mansfield, the bombshell who played dumb too well. Jane Mansfield had it all on paper: sky-high IQ of 163, fluent in 5 languages, a classically trained violinist. She could have been a powerhouse in any field. But instead of showing off brains, she doubled down on boobs and blonde jokes, and it worked until it didn't. From the moment she hit Hollywood in the 1950s, Jane turned herself into a walking headline. Champagne bubble baths. Check. Wardrobe malfunctions that accidentally made front pages, double check. She wasn't just in movies, she was in every tabloid, and she loved it. The tragedy wasn't that Jane lacked intelligence, it was that she weaponized stupidity. Studios bought the act so hard, they forgot she could actually act. In The Girl Can't Help It and Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, critics dismissed her as parody. And when serious roles came knocking, Jane often slammed the door. She once rejected a Broadway revival simply because it didn't come with TV exposure. Subtlety wasn't her thing. Shock value was. On the set of Promises, Promises, Hollywood's first mainstream nude flick, she cared less about performance and more about making sure people were gasping in theaters. Behind the glitter, her personal life was pure chaos. Her marriage to bodybuilder Mickey Hargitay spiraled into nasty court battles. She dabbled in strange company like Anton LaVey from the Church of Satan, and surrounded herself with bizarre stunts that made even Hollywood raise its eyebrows. By the mid-60s, she was stuck in low-budget European films, so incoherent they made Ed Wood look like Hitchcock. Then tragedy struck. In 1967, Jane's life ended in a horrific car accident at just 34. The public remembered the dumb blonde more than the polyglot genius behind it. Number 6. Frank Fay, the funniest man nobody could stand. In the 1920s, Frank Fay was the king of comedy. On stage, he was untouchable, razor-sharp timing, silky voice, and the kind of confidence that could make a crowd howl with just a raised eyebrow. George Burns once called him the funniest man who ever lived. Sounds great, right? Well, Burns added, and the most detestable human being I ever met. That about sums it up. Fay's ego was so massive it made his tuxedo look tight. At Warner Brothers, he rewrote scripts without permission, mocked crew members to their faces, and ignored directors entirely. He believed rules didn't apply to him because in his mind, he was the show. Off stage, he was even worse, openly racist, proudly anti-Semitic, and constantly drunk. At a time when Hollywood was trying to clean up its image, Fay was the guy screaming insults in nightclubs and getting arrested for disorderly conduct. His marriage to Barbara Stanwyck, one of the brightest stars of the era, ended in disaster. She cited abuse, both emotional and physical, and walked away while Hollywood quietly did the same. When sound films arrived, Fay sneered at them as beneath me. By the time he swallowed his pride and took a talkie role, critics ripped him apart for being wooden and disconnected. Offers dried up faster than a bootleg whiskey barrel. By the 1950s, the once great stage king was performing in dingy clubs his audience made up of drunks who barely knew his name. Frank Fay didn't just fall from grace, he swan-dived into obscurity with arrogance as his anchor. Number 7. William Frawley, Fred Mertz, and the drunk who almost lost Lucy. William Frawley will forever be remembered as Fred Mertz, the grumpy neighbor on I Love Lucy. That role cemented him in TV history, but behind the scenes, Frawley was less lovably cranky and more walking HR complaint. Before Lucy saved his career, he was a struggling character actor in the 30s and 40s, known mostly for showing up late, slurring lines, and driving directors insane. More than one had him blacklisted for blowing takes because he couldn't stay sober long enough to deliver them. His reputation was so bad that when Lucille Ball first heard his name for I Love Lucy, she flat out said no. She didn't want a drunk wrecking her new sitcom. It was only Desi Arnaz who convinced her to give him a shot under strict conditions, show up sober on time, and don't cause chaos. To everyone's surprise, Frawley managed it, at least while the cameras were rolling. Offset, the old habits came roaring back. He picked fights in bars, got banned from multiple Hollywood lounges, and maintained his status as one of the industry's least cooperative actors. Frawley also had a chip on his shoulder about modern acting. He sneered at rehearsals and told younger co-stars, "If you need to practice, you shouldn't be in this business." Translation: laziness disguised as wisdom. When I Love Lucy ended, producers hesitated to cast him again, afraid he'd regress into his worst behavior. Number 8. Jean Arthur, the star who wanted nothing to do with stardom. Jean Arthur had one of the most unforgettable voices in Hollywood. Husky, warm, and instantly recognizable. Pair that with her expressive eyes and sharp comic timing, and it's no wonder she shined in Frank Capra classics like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. On screen, she was magnetic. Off-screen, she wanted nothing to do with Hollywood or the people who watched her. Arthur suffered from crippling stage fright and social anxiety, which is a bit inconvenient when your job is, being famous. She refused press interviews, skipped premieres, and often slipped out of back doors to avoid reporters. Frank Capra recalled how she would vanish for months between projects like a ghost no one could pin down. During the filming of The More the Merrier, she reportedly had breakdowns over lighting and costumes, demanding sets be rebuilt, so no crew members had to watch her act. And while her peers were scooping up iconic roles, Arthur turned them down left and right, His Girl Friday. It's a Wonderful Life, even parts written specifically for her. Columbia Pictures practically begged her to extend her contract in 1944, but she walked away into semi-retirement with no clear plan other than not having to deal with fame anymore. Later in life, she returned not to the screen, but to a classroom at Vassar College teaching acting. Students described her as evasive, cryptic, and distant, like she still couldn't quite handle human interaction. Number 9. Buster Crabbe. Flash Gordon Tarzan, and the hero who forgot his lines. Buster Crabbe was America's golden boy. Olympic gold medalist in swimming jawline carved from marble, the kind of physique that made casting directors say, "Who cares if he can act?" Hollywood wasted no time slapping a loincloth on him as Tarzan, then tossing him into space as Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. He was the ultimate action serial star, the kind of guy kids cheered for and parents tolerated. On set, directors quickly learned their scripts were in danger every time Buster opened his mouth. He often forgot lines, stumbled through takes, or botched delivery so badly they had to dub over him in post-production. One director literally designed scenes with as little dialogue as possible. Just give the man a sword, a vine, or a laser gun and hope for the best. Outside the camera, his choices were just as questionable. When offered serious, dramatic roles, Buster shrugged them off. He believed audiences didn't want serious Crabbe, only action Crabbe. In short, he put himself in a box and nailed the lid shut. His investments equally doomed. At one point, he sank money into a chain of backyard swimming pool franchises. It flopped spectacularly thanks to lawsuits and poor management. Even when television came calling in the 50s with a Flash Gordon reboot. Buster demanded creative control, then lost interest halfway through, leaving producers scrambling. Number 10. Esther Williams, the million-dollar mermaid who sank on dry land. Esther Williams was Hollywood's million-dollar mermaid, the queen of synchronized swimming spectacles in the 1940s and 50s. Nobody could glide through a pool in sequins while diving off a trapeze quite like her. MGM built entire water ballets around her, turning swimming into box office gold. She was dazzling, athletic, photogenic, basically the human version of a fountain show at the Bellagio. But the second you drained the pool, Esther was like a fish flopping on the deck. Williams openly admitted she rarely bothered to read her scripts. If there wasn't a swimming scene, she tuned out. "If it doesn't involve a pool, I'm not interested," she once joked. Directors like Charles Walters had to design entire films around her ability to hold her breath, instead of her ability to hold a scene. When it came to acting chops, Esther was more chlorine than Shakespeare. Her personal life just as slippery. She married 4 times, and in one case gave up her career entirely because her husband, Fernando Lamas, demanded it. Her response: he was strong. I liked strong. Not exactly the stuff of feminist manifestos. Business wasn't kinder. Her swimwear line tanked due to poor planning, and she famously dismissed television as beneath her just as the medium was exploding. By the late 60s, her career was drying up faster than an empty MGM water tank. Number 11. Milton Berle, Mr. Television who couldn't change the channel. In the 1950s, Milton Berle was bigger than life itself. They called him Mr. Television, and with good reason. His show, Texaco Star Theater, pulled in more than 80% of America's viewers. That's not a rating. That's a hostage situation. At his peak, he was the man who single-handedly sold TV sets to the nation. But Berle had one major problem. He thought the jokes that made him famous in 1948 would still kill in 1968. Spoiler, they didn't. Berle was notorious for stealing material from other comedians. He rated vaudeville routines that were older than the audience watching him. And when writers begged to modernize, he barked, "This is what made me famous." He fired staff on whims, demanded approval over scripts he never actually read, and insisted on hogging the spotlight. Collaboration. Forget it. Berle wanted the laughs and only for himself. His business instincts were equally disastrous. When MGM dangled a fat movie contract, he turned it down because he didn't want to give up nightclub gigs. Later, he invested in a chain of comedy clubs under his own name but refused to visit them. 2 years later, they were all gone poof like one of his recycled punchlines. By the 1960s, TV had changed. Comedy was sharper, fresher, riskier. Burlesque still wheeling out the same dusty gags, baffling audiences who wondered if their grandpa had hijacked the set. Guest spots in later years only proved how badly he'd aged out of the game. Number 12, Marlene Dietrich, the femme fatale, who outsmarted everyone by playing dumb. Marlene Dietrich was the definition of mystery, smoky voice, razor-sharp cheekbones, and a gaze that could melt steel. From the Blue Angel to Morocco, she was the ultimate femme fatale, a star so alluring that directors practically reshaped entire films around her. But behind the sequins and shadows, Marlene was playing her own long con. She pretended to be dumber than she was. In reality, Dietrich was fluent in English and German, and her private letters prove she was whip-smart. But when it came to contract disputes with Paramount in the 1930s, she'd suddenly act like she didn't understand English. When asked about politics, she'd shrug and claim ignorance. On set, she let male directors dictate her lighting blocking, even her line delivery, all while cultivating a public persona of passive compliance. Privately, she was the opposite. Her correspondence, now preserved in Berlin, reveals a cunning strategist who knew exactly how to manipulate Hollywood's male ego. As she once said, men are frightened of smart women. They prefer a whisper to a sentence. So she whispered, and it worked. For a while. The downside. When the studio system crumbled in the 1950s, Marlene had no backup plan. She wasn't a producer, writer, or director, like her tougher contemporaries Bette Davis or Katharine Hepburn. Instead, she fell back on cabaret tours draped in glitter and nostalgia. Audiences still adored her, but Hollywood had moved on. Number 13. Tony Curtis, the pretty boy who couldn't get serious. Tony Curtis went from a tough New York street kid to one of Hollywood's biggest matinee idols. With that jawline, those dreamy eyes, and a swagger that screamed leading man, he looked like central casting's idea of perfection. And for a while it worked. Sweet smell of success, Spartacus, some like it hot. He was everywhere. But here's the catch, Tony was often more interested in being seen than in being good. Directors joked that working with Curtis was like pulling teeth. Billy Wilder, who directed him in Some Like It Hot, said he had to coax the performance frame by frame. Complex material bored him. Scripts, he admitted he rarely read them all the way through. In one infamous interview, he even called Laurence Olivier that English guy who yells a lot. Subtlety was not his strength. Instead of chasing prestige roles, Curtis leaned into vanity projects movies that highlighted his looks, not his chops. And while contemporaries like Paul Newman and Marlon Brando dug deeper into craft, Curtis stayed on the surface, flashing a grin while opportunities for real greatness slipped away. His personal life was just as chaotic: 6 marriages, whirlwind romances, and tabloid-ready antics. For someone so desperate to be taken seriously, he spent an awful lot of time acting unserious. Number 14. Guy Madison, the pretty face that couldn't act its way out of a paper bag. Guy Madison wasn't discovered in a theater or a casting call, he was literally plucked off a telephone pole. A Hollywood agent spotted him working as a lineman and thought that jawline belongs on the big screen. And just like that, Robert Mosley became Guy Madison, the heartthrob of the 1950s. With his chiseled looks and all-American vibe, he became a teen idol almost overnight. But there was a tiny problem: Madison had the acting range of a bookshelf. Critics noticed immediately. His line delivery was wooden, his expressions barely moved, and directors often needed endless takes just to get a passable scene. William Castle once joked that Madison had the personality of a bookshelf ouch. On set, he even asked producers which way to face the camera well into his fourth movie. Yet somehow, audiences swooned. Madison headlined westerns like The Charge at Feather River, looking the part of rugged cowboy hero even if he sounded like he was reading instructions off a cereal box. The studios loved his photogenic face, but everyone behind the scenes knew the truth. Madison was a star by accident, not by talent. Off-camera, his decisions were equally questionable. He bought a ranch in Wyoming, with no staff, no plan, and no income strategy. It failed spectacularly. When Hollywood roles dried up in the 60s, Madison drifted into low-budget European films, many of them so badly dubbed, it didn't matter that he still couldn't deliver a line. Number 15, Rod Steiger, the method actor who took method too far. Rod Steiger was the kind of actor who made critics swoon. He delivered powerhouse performances in On the Waterfront, The Pawnbroker, and In the Heat of the Night. He even won an Oscar. On screen, he was intense, magnetic, impossible to ignore. But off-screen, Steiger was so obsessed with method acting that he often turned film sets into therapy sessions nobody asked for. Directors dreaded his process. On Dr. Zhivago, David Lean clashed with him constantly because Rod refused to rehearse scenes cold. Instead, he insisted on winding himself into an emotional frenzy before shooting, delaying production for hours. Omar Sharif later said, working with him was exhausting, and not in the fun gym workout way. Steiger's perfectionism spilled into career choices too. He turned down Patton because he thought the script lacked emotional depth. George C. Scott took the role, won an Oscar, and walked into film history. Then Steiger rejected The Godfather, calling it too commercial. Another Oscar-winning role down the drain. Years later, he admitted regretting both decisions, but by then, Hollywood had moved on. When projects did come his way, Steiger often clashed with producers blaming the industry for not understanding his genius. Colleagues, however, described him as moody, combative, and exhausting to work with. Sidney Lumet put it best, Rod was brilliant, but he made things harder than they had to be on everyone. By the end of his career, Steiger was battling depression, money problems, and a string of low-budget foreign films that barely paid the bills. Number 16. Earl Holliman, the nice guy who played it way too safe. Earl Holliman came into Hollywood looking like he was built for the long haul. He had the charm, the looks, and even a Golden Globe for The Rainmaker in 1956. He shared the screen with Elvis Presley, John Wayne, and other giants. Everything screamed future legend. But instead of climbing higher, Holliman hit cruise control and never took it off. Studios quickly noticed a pattern. Holliman always wanted to play the safe, all-American fella. When offered roles that required accents, dramatic range, or even a little political edge, he flat out refused. Judgment at Nuremberg, too heavy. Stage work, too risky. Dialect training. Forget it. He wanted to be the guy next door forever, even when audiences were ready for more. Directors found him pleasant, but frustrating. Richard Fleischer, who directed him in The Trap, said it best, he wasn't difficult. He just didn't stretch. And in Hollywood, not stretching is basically career suicide. His off-screen decisions didn't help either. Holliman poured money into a restaurant venture in Burbank that flopped within 3 years thanks to mismanagement. When television opportunities started booming in the early 60s, he brushed them off, convinced film would always be there for him. Spoiler, it wasn't. By the 1980s, Holliman was still working, but in smaller and smaller parts, his early promise fading with each role. He was never scandalous, never hated, never canceled. He was just forgettable. Number 17. Peter Lorre, the genius who trapped himself in creepy roles. Peter Lorre had one of the most unforgettable faces in Hollywood, bulging eyes, soft voice, and a screen presence that could make you shiver without him lifting a finger. In M1931, he gave one of the greatest performances ever put on film, and later he was unforgettable in The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca. He was smart, witty, multilingual, and classically trained. But Hollywood didn't see Peter Lorre, the intellectual. They saw Peter Lorre, the creepy little guy. And tragically, Peter believed them. When he came to the US fleeing Nazi Germany, he was terrified of unemployment. So when studios offered him typecast villain roles, the madman, the foreign eccentric, the twitchy henchman, he said yes, and kept saying yes. Directors like John Huston tried to hand him meatier dramatic parts, but Lorre would turn them down, convinced audiences wouldn't buy him as anything but the weirdo. It wasn't Hollywood boxing him in, it was his own insecurity. Behind the scenes, his choices were just as shaky. He became addicted to morphine in the 1940s,